Um, Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third session in this Connect to Learning webinar series on education neuroscience. As you all know, we will later put a link to a Google form where you would need to input your details so that we can take the attendance. As you also know, this is a collaboration between the Institute of Education at the University College London, Educational Neuroscience Hub, and the Faculty of Education that we're bringing this together for you, talking about education neuroscience and different aspects of the area. Today with us we have Joe, and I will leave the word to Erica to give a word on this idea, and then eventually to Michelle to introduce the speaker.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Joe, for being here, for accepting our invitation to give an overview on the myths and facts about dyscalculia. Our aim in organizing these webinars is to create awareness and a better understanding of the development of the brain within the context of teaching and learning, and teachers who use a scientifically informed approach to evaluate educational assertions will be able to help their pupils learn more effectively. A teacher's ability to understand how the brain works and how they influence students' learning should be at the very heart of education. And more importantly, these webinars also aim to create a bridge, a common language between science researchers and practitioners, as well as parents, enhancing evidence-based strategies, which are more likely to succeed with today's students. So thank you, and hope you enjoy this informative talk. Michelle, on to you.
Yes, I'm first going to introduce our speaker, Joe van Herwegen. Dr. Joe van Herwegen is an associate professor at UCL Institute of Education and director of the Child Development and Learning Difficulties Lab. He's a member of the Management Committee for the Center for Educational Neuroscience and a member of the Executive Committee for the European Association for Research on Learning and Instruction. Her research focuses on improving educational outcomes, especially for those with special educational needs and learning difficulties, using evidence from developmental psychology, educational neuroscience, and neurodevelopmental disorders. She was awarded the British Psychology Society Developmental Section Margaret Donaldson Prize in 2020 for her contribution to developmental psychology and impact, and her research on mathematical development has contributed to the Families Connect program from Save the Children and the Dyscalculia definition from Education Scotland. I'll now briefly introduce this webinar, Facts and Myths about Dyscalculia. Good mathematical abilities have been related to successful financial, physical, and mental health outcomes. Yet, a significant proportion of individuals, up to 22%, have mathematical learning difficulties, and dyscalculia is as prevalent as dyslexia. Prevalence of 6%, 1 to 2 children per class of 30. However, dyscalculia is less well known. In this talk, she will discuss findings from several studies, several surveys with teachers, trainee teachers, and students about the facts and myths around dyscalculia, where these neuromyths come from, why they matter, and how they can be addressed. And with that short introduction, Joe, I give the floor to you, and we very eagerly await to listen to what you have to tell us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this invitation and lovely introduction. So welcome, everybody. So I don't have to introduce anymore what I'm going to be talking about today, so I can skip these. And as it was mentioned before, mathematical abilities are very important in daily life. Just have a think for a minute about what kind of mathematical activities you might have done today in your day-to-day. So maybe you've read a clock, maybe you've gone shopping and compared values, you know, how much a loaf of bread would cost, how much it costed yesterday, and how much you paid at the till. Maybe you've caught a bus or a train and had to look at the number or a timetable to make sure you caught a right bus, or you might be doing some cooking at the moment and looking at recipes. In the end, we know that mathematical abilities predict educational outcomes, and that leads to financial success, but also relates to health outcomes as well as well-being. And that might be because people who've got better educational outcomes and better mathematical abilities are better able to understand risk, think about vaccinations and COVID, for example. So what is then developmental dyscalculia? So it's a specific learning disorder or condition that is of biological origin, that manifests itself with problems in acquiring academic skills, with especially mathematical abilities being below age level. And we can already see these difficulties occur within the early school years. Now, it's important, and I'll come back to this later on, is to make the difference between developmental dyscalculia and performing low on mathematical abilities per se. The difference between is that children might be performing low on mathematical abilities for a number of reasons. They're not motivated. They may come from low socioeconomic status families. There might be some language barriers. So think about children who've got a second language. But what's important with developmental dyscalculia is that we see these children performing low on mathematical tasks for a long time. So at a minimum of 6 months apart. And these difficulties cannot be attributed to other difficulties such as intellectual disabilities, other neurodevelopmental conditions, or neurological or motor disorders. So if we look at what the prevalence of dyscalculia is, we're talking then about, children who perform on mathematical tasks below the 10th centile. And this is about 6 to 7% of the population. So about 1 in 20 people. So if you've got an average classroom in the UK, for example, which, classrooms go up to 33 children, we know there's about 2 children in every classroom that are likely to have dyscalculia. These children don't grow out of their difficulties with mathematics, and it persists well into adulthood. But you might also come across developmental dyscalculia, or dyscalculia for short, under other names, such as, for example, in the US, it's often referred to as mathematics disorder or mathematics disability, and some refer to it as mathematics learning disorder, or MLD, as well. But as I mentioned, it's important to make a difference between children who are low achievers for maths, which might occur for various reasons. And these are the children who are at the lower end of the distribution. So we think about those who perform at the 25th or the bottom quarter of a classroom, compared to those who've got really dyscalculia or MLD, who are really at below the 10th centile and show these issues persistently. So what kind of difficulties do children with dyscalculia show? Well, first and foremost is we see issues around counting procedures, which are then used to solve arithmetic problems, and especially counting backwards, but also other counting issues, such as, for example, illegal counts. So starting to count in tens and then switching to 100s, omitting the decade number, unable to cross decade boundaries, so going from 28, 29, and then rather going to 30, going back to 21, 22. Confusing auditory confusion between teen and tie. So if children are counting 70, 80, 90, 20, 21, 22, so there's been an issue here. And I already mentioned counting backwards as well. So we see a lot of immature counting. We also see another difficulties, an inability to retrieve arithmetic facts from memory. And so what might happen is that rather than being able to retrieve, say, timetable knowledge or number bonds, so knowing that 4 and 6 make 10, but also 3 and 7 make 10, these kind of number bonds, children have to work them out. And because they have issues with counting, they often have to rely then on their fingers. So we see a lot more longer sticking to counting with fingers compared to age-appropriate peers, for example. We also see difficulties with subitizing. Now, subitizing is your ability to very quickly say how many items you see without having to count. So for example, if I hold up 4 fingers, you don't have to count 4. Many of you will be able to say 4 immediately without the need to count. So this is your ability of subitizing. You can do this for small numbers, such as with dice and with fingers, but you can also do this with larger numbers, like I've shown you here in the bottom. So you don't have to count the blue dots to know there's more blue dots than red dots. For not larger numbers, we can kind of see approximately how many they are. Like you can see approximately whether you've got enough chairs in a classroom, or approximately whether you've got enough paper and pens ready. So this is very important, this subitizing, because one, for small numbers, you don't have to count, you can immediately see it and use that knowledge to do arithmetic in general. For the larger number where we do an approximation, it's not about having it correctly, but knowing approximately where is more. This ability allows us to check facts. You might have happened this before, where you might have been adding numbers on a calculator and you kind of come to the conclusion that something must have gone wrong. And that's kind of your ability to approximate numbers as well. So we know that these abilities are very important for further mathematical abilities. We also see some more advanced difficulties with advanced counting procedures. So, for example, a lot of children with dyscalculia, have to, rather than being able to start from 5 and add 2 numbers, they'll have to start from the beginning. So they start 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, add 2, 6, 7. So that means it takes them longer to find answers to mathematical problems, but because they have issues with counting, it also makes them more prone to make further errors. There's also an inaccurate mapping of different number representations. So think about when children have to put words into digits or digits into words, that kind of transcoding might be a difficulty. We also see issues with understanding the place value system. So understanding that how the 3 and the 3 in 13 and the 3 in 30 and the 3 in 33, how they all have different meanings, basically. And this might result in difficulties when doing column addition, for example, and not understanding where the place value is. We see also problems with understanding procedures and concepts, and this means, knowing how to work out particular problems. So one example here could be that if a child is asked, if a year group has 35 girls and 75 boys, what's the percentage of students that are girls? And so in order to work this out, children need to have an understanding of particular procedures and concepts, such as calculating percentages, which is a difficulty for those with dyscalculia. And also we see problems in decomposing problems into easier ones. And so, for example, if we say to children, take 26 and add 15, it might be easier to know, well, 20 and 10 make 30, and 6 and 5, which are your units, make 11. So this is 31. So this kind of breaking problems down into easier ones is an issue. So there are a number of difficulties that children with dyscalculia experience. Also around how numbers fit together. Now, this relates to the idea that many of you, when we ask people, think about numbers, most people will say, well, when I think about numbers, I might think about numbers being in a line in my mind, with small numbers being on the left and larger numbers being on the right. And indeed, this is what we see for people who read, for example, in English or in many European languages where you read from left to right, is that when people think about a small number, they'll be thinking, you will see the eyes move towards the left corner of their eyes. When we ask people to think about a large number, people look towards the right top corner of their eyes, suggesting that people indeed think about numbers in a number line, if you like. And we know that for children with dyscalculia, that this is a difficulty. They don't really have a very well-established number line or an understanding of how numbers fit together. We also see that they have problems with understanding concepts like less than, more than, also understanding of symbols and knowing what these symbols stand for. So for example, addition means you add up, you go towards the right of the number line. You take away means, you go towards the left of the number line, you get less items. And it also relates to, many people with dyscalculia have problems telling left from right, as well as reading a clock. So there's a number of aspects of mathematical development that are impacted by dyscalculia. Of course, and I forgot the last one, which is working out pounds and coins in terms of money and value of that money. In terms of what causes developmental dyscalculia, we know it runs in families. We know that there's probably also a genetic origin for dyscalculia, although it's unlikely there's going to be one gene that is deleted. It's more likely that dyscalculia is the outcome of many genes working together. However, when we think about cognitive origins of dyscalculia, there have been two theories that have been put forward. One of them is a core deficit hypothesis, which argues that dyscalculia is caused by a single core deficit to magnitude processing. So this is this understanding of how numbers relate to each other and where is more. So typically what we see is that children with dyscalculia have difficulties with tasks where they have to say which number is larger, 3 or 5, or where there are more dots. Is it, the ones on the left or the ones on the right, without counting. There is some evidence from brain development as well that this is a possible explanation, because what we see is that individuals with dyscalculia have less activation in the intraparietal sulcus. This is what IPS stands for. And that's an area that we know is related in the brain to mathematical problem solving. So we see fewer activation there. And as I mentioned, we see this evidence for this core deficit hypothesis in tasks such as symbolic comparison and non-symbolic comparison tasks. Now, the issue with this kind of core deficit hypothesis is that although it explains some of the difficulties we see in children with dyscalculia, it can't explain why many children with dyscalculia have difficulties with number fact retrieval and have issues in that area. So another hypothesis that has been put forward is an access deficit hypothesis, which argues that when children are born, we know from studies in infants, and typically developing infants, that they are able to already discriminate where is more and have an understanding of 2 versus 3 dots, and say where is more dots. So there's some kind of understanding of magnitudes, just like we see animals have an understanding of magnitudes. So we know that this magnitude representation system develops very early on in life. And we know that that's the basis for further mathematical development. However, as children are growing up and they learn languages, they'll also start learning the symbolic aspects of mathematics. So the number names, what the digits are, how number names relate to digits, etc. And so this symbolic knowledge needs to be linked to this kind of magnitude representation system that develops early onwards. And so the hypothesis that's being put forward is that children with dyscalculia have difficulties in connecting those two different types of knowledge. So this kind of subitizing magnitude representation and linking that to the symbolic knowledge and making a number line or a number sense that is coherent and represents numbers accurately. The reason why I bring this up and why you might think, why is this important, is because later on when we talk about what kind of different interventions might work for people with dyscalculia, it's important to kind of think, are we going to focus our attention on a core deficit, or is it more likely that we need to give children training in connecting and making the systems talk to each other, or giving them an understanding of how numbers relate to each other? One of the things is that it's not easy to diagnose dyscalculia, and that's because dyscalculia is often heterogeneous and commonly comorbid. So we know that being good at maths does not just relate to your mathematical ability, but also to some domain general abilities like your working memory, executive functions, and processing speed. And research has shown that these areas may also be areas of difficulty for those with developmental dyscalculia. So for example, we know that children with developmental dyscalculia, some of them have working memory difficulties, have problems with executive functioning and planning, as well as processing information very quickly, or understanding spatial relationships might be an issue. And this is where we might, this might form an explanation as to why we see a high co-occurrence of dyscalculia with, for example, dyslexia. So children with dyscalculia, 40% of them also have a diagnosis for dyslexia. And that might be because both have could be caused by a common deficit in phonological processing or processing speed. We also see that children with dyscalculia, up to 24% of them have a comorbid diagnosis for ADHD. And this might be because there might be some shared attention or working memory difficulties. So I've given you a whistle-tour stop around what is dyscalculia and what might be the issues there. And I want to now move us on to kind of neuromyths and what are the myths about dyscalculia. And the reason why I bring up neuromyths is that, these are kind of misunderstandings of science about the brain and learning, and often a result of an oversimplification of scientific results, as well as sensationalism and the omission of important information. Some of the neuromyths you might be familiar with is the idea that, if drinking water enhances learning, or that when you're dehydrated, that you can't learn. And this comes from the misunderstanding that indeed our brain is made up of a lot of water, and that if we don't have enough water in the brain, then that might hinder our learning, although we know that that's not the case. We also know the other misunderstanding is that students only use 10% of their brains, for example, or my favorite, that children might learn better if they're taught in their preferred learning style, whether they're visual learners or kinesthetic learners, which we know is not true. So these neuromyths are often widespread amongst the public. And a few years ago, my colleagues and I at the Center of Educational Neuroscience did a study around, but what do people believe about special educational needs and disabilities? What are neuromyths related to those with learning difficulties? And we first focused on the 5 most common learning difficulties or special educational needs. So autism, ADHD, dyslexia, Down syndrome, and then general learning difficulties. And there are a few examples here on the screen. So for ADHD, a common neuromyth is that special diets are an effective treatment of ADHD, or that when you give children with ADHD sugar, they should become more hyperactive, that those with autism do not like to be touched, that dyslexia can be helped by using colored lenses or colored overlays, which comes from the misunderstanding that dyslexia is caused by visual stress. So we know that for some children, visual stress can impact on their reading abilities, but we know that dyslexia itself is not caused by visual stress. So a visual overlay will not help children with dyslexia per se. So we did that research and we looked at, my slide should have been in the other order. So are neuromyths good or bad? I want to go back to that for a minute before moving on to what we found in our research. So I think some neuromyths are good because it shows that teachers and people in general are interested in the brain and how the brain develops, right? Otherwise, people would not remember that kind of information. It also is good because it implies that educators think that an understanding of mechanisms of learning is relevant to their practice, which is why you're all here tonight. Hopefully you're learning something new. So that's a good thing. But obviously, and I'll come back to this later on, it's a sign of poor communication between scientists and educators. So that's not good. It's particularly bad because it can lead to activities in the classroom that have no basis in fact. So for example, if people believe that dyslexia is caused by visual stress, people might give children with dyslexia a colored overlay, but we know that this is not going to help many children with dyslexia, so it might lead to poor practice. And of course, many people, when we say neuromyths, the media also always gives a lot of attention to it, and there's some kind of clickbait happening. And what I want to say in the rest of my talk is definitely not everything you thought you knew is wrong kind of idea, but kind of put some of these neuromyths more into perspective. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit more before moving on to what we showed in our research. So in 2021, we published our research around what educators and members of the general public in the UK, what they knew about these neuromyths that related to neurodevelopmental disorders. And we asked them, we gave them 15 true and false statements about the general neuromyths. So this was drinking water helps and learning in your preferred learning style is better, and as well as 30 new statements that we developed, which asked about neuromyths related to neurodevelopmental conditions. And we had 569 participants, of which 203 came from an education background or were teachers or work in education, and then 366 people from the general public. What did we find? Well, we found no significant difference between educators and members of the general public, either for our general neuromyths as well as those for neurodevelopmental conditions. We did see that there was an improvement compared to previous studies in that general neuromyths were less endorsed, and kind of suggests that people might have become more familiar with these general neuromyths, and so we see that there's been an improvement. We also know that people who had more knowledge about the brain in general we also saw across both groups that there were fewer neuromyths endorsed about the general brain compared to neurodevelopmental disorders. So there's less knowledge about brain development in neurodevelopmental disorders. But we also saw within the neurodevelopmental disorders that there was a difference between our different categories. So people endorsed fewer neuromyths related to autism. And that made us think around why that might be. And obviously in the UK, there's been a lot of awareness campaigns related to autism, as well as the Autism Act from 2009. And teachers already reported to us that there's just more opportunities in terms of continued professional development related to autism than, for example, ADHD or dyslexia. The other good news was that those participants who accessed information about the brain did better in both groups than those who accessed information less about the brain. So in last year, we also looked at what does this look like in other countries. And so I had a student who looked at the endorsement of neuromyths in Kuwait, as well as one student who looked at this in Colombia. And again, we had some participants from the general public, as well as those from who worked in education, either as teachers or as pre-service teachers. And again, we find very similar findings in terms of that, although the scores were slightly lower in Kuwait and Colombia compared to the UK, the pattern of the results was the same in terms that general neuromyths were less endorsed than neuromyths related to neurodevelopmental disorders, and that there was no difference between teachers and members of the general public in those countries. We couldn't do this for Colombia because we didn't have, I don't have that information to hand. So I hear you say now, but what about dyscalculia, which we hadn't included in our original study. So last year, I had the opportunity to work with Education Scotland and to provide a continued professional development session for 67 people who worked within education. Unfortunately, we didn't have any further background information about these participants, but we gave these participants some questions and neuromyths related to dyscalculia as well as dyslexia. And some of the interesting things we found was that actually half of, that these participants endorsed half of the neuromyths. So they got about 50% of answers correct related to dyscalculia, and they had slightly less answers correct related to dyslexia. However, I have to say that this difference is not significant. But it kind of shows that there's more work to be done in this area in terms of what teachers understand about dyslexia as well as dyscalculia. So commonly endorsed neuromyths with things like the dyscalculic brain is wired differently, which causes problems with maths, but is often associated with strengths like creativity, strategic thinking, and intuitive thinking. And the reason why this is a neuromyth is that although some children, of course, just like any other typically developing child, might be creative and think strategically and has intuitive thinking, having a diagnosis of dyscalculia doesn't necessarily make children more creative. Okay, so there are some children with dyscalculia, just like other children, who are less creative, less strategic thinkers, etc. Another commonly endorsed neuromyth is that if a student continues to struggle with math, it's highly likely that they are dyscalculic. And I mentioned this before already, that there are many reasons sometimes why children struggle with math. It's not because they struggle with math that they automatically have dyscalculia. And this is why it's important that when you think a child might have dyscalculia, to do some careful observations as to why is it that this child is struggling. Is it necessarily dyscalculia, or could there be other reasons? Students who are dyscalculic usually only have problems with numbers and can read and write at typical levels is another neuromyth, because as I've shown you before, there's a high comorbidity between dyscalculia and dyslexia. And so there's a higher likeliness that children who are dyscalculic also have difficulties with reading and writing because they might have dyslexia. Because of time, I'm going to skip the neuromyths around dyslexia. But I'm going to move us on to the next survey we did, which was one in the UK, where we had 299 participants. Again, these were either teachers, teaching assistants, or other educational practitioners who fulfilled various roles within schools, who completed our survey on neuromyths related to dyslexia and dyscalculia. But this time we had more background information so that we could see what are the kind of factors that might be driving the endorsement of neuromyths, which we couldn't do in our previous studies. So overall, again, we found that, that these participants endorsed quite a number of neuromyths. So in terms of percentages correct, we see for dyscalculia, it was 63%. And for dyslexia, this group of participants had 42% of the statements correct. Although that again looks like a large difference, this difference was not significant. And in terms of the neuromyths, it was very similar to the findings we had before with our participants from Education Scotland. So the same top 3 for both dyscalculia and dyslexia was found. We also looked at kind of how much these participants were aware in terms of different special educational needs groups. And the reason why I bring this up is because some very interesting facts. So we included some neurodevelopmental conditions that are very rare, like Williams syndrome. And as you can see, this is the overall score for all participants. So basically how this is scored is that I took the number of participants, like here 159, and if they gave it a score of 1, so they're not very familiar with it, then obviously it's 159 points. And then 34 was multiplied by 2, 19 multiplied by 3, etc. So you kind of get an overall familiarity kind of score. And as we can see, that score for Williams syndrome is very low because it's a very rare genetic condition. I'm, not surprised that teachers may not be familiar with this at all. So that kind of makes sense. And then if we look at, for example, autism, we see that that gets the highest score and that most teachers were very familiar or extremely familiar with autism. Now, when we then look at dyslexia and dyscalculia, again, here we can see that there's a big difference, and this was significant in this case. So teachers were more familiar with dyslexia than they were with dyscalculia. We also saw in our study that awareness of dyscalculia, in terms of awareness of dyscalculia, that most teachers were able to give a good definition of dyscalculia, and only 16% of teachers were unable to provide some kind of valid definition. So most teachers are able to say what dyscalculia is. However, having said this, only 30% of the teachers, up to 30% of the teachers were unable to say how they would identify a student with dyscalculia. And about 30% were not able to list anything they could do to help a student with dyscalculia, showing that there is a little bit of a gap in knowledge here. We did find that those who had more years of experience with special educational needs had higher scores, so endorsed fewer neuromyths, that those who were having a degree, a SENCO, a NASENCO, or an inclusion lead role had higher awareness of dyscalculia and endorsed fewer neuromyths. And also that if staff held a maths lead role in their school, they did better compared to those without that role. Showing that, training and awareness really helps. I already mentioned a little bit why endorsement of these neuromyths matter. So for time purposes, I can go through this a bit quicker. So we know that the endorsements of neuromyths per se does not impact on the quality of teaching, but it has some significant implications in terms of what practices teachers adopt, but also how students are identified. So for example, if someone believes that children, I'm going to use an example from dyslexia because it's easier, that children with dyslexia always make letter reversals. And you have a child who has difficulties with reading and writing, makes some errors, but doesn't make letter reversals, then this might mean that some children who have dyslexia do not get referred for a diagnosis because that child is not making letter reversals. And as I mentioned, some children then might not receive the support they need because of these kind of neuromyths that are being endorsed. One of the things that I wanted to point out is that, we know that dyscalculia is underdiagnosed in the UK, but also in the US, and I assume it's the same in other countries. And this has often been linked to teachers saying that there are fewer opportunities for teachers to learn about dyscalculia, which is true. Very few initial teacher training courses cover dyscalculia, and there are also fewer opportunities for continued professional development. But other things relate to certain myths as well. So for example, we were working with some teachers, and one of the teachers said, you only need numbers for maths classes, whilst you need good reading abilities for all classes. And thus, if you're not teaching maths, then as a teacher, you might not notice that a child has any maths difficulties or dyscalculia. And of course, this is not completely true. If we look at all the subjects, so this is the top 10 of subjects at the bottom here, of the number of A-levels that students did in the UK in 2022. So we see mathematics, psychology, biology, chemistry, sociology, history, art, design, business studies, and physics. If we look at all of these topics, you need very good mathematical abilities for all of them. I mean, even for history, if you confuse 1264 and 1624, that's a gap of 400 years. And in terms of, historical knowledge and facts, that would go very wrong. So there is this kind of, myth that you can only diagnose dyscalculia in maths classes. But I think, that that's not necessarily the case, and that actually number knowledge affects all subjects. So how do we address these neuromyths, and what can we do about them? So one of them obviously is for us to give talks and make sure that there is better communication between neuroscientists and educators. So thank you, James, Erica, and Michelle, for organizing this series. But also we know that it's important for teachers to have time for critical reflection. So to think about, what is the knowledge that you endorse and why is the evidence for it? We also need better training programs. So Let's Buy and Harry's, for example, showed that there are a number of initial teacher training handbooks that contain neuromyths, not a good thing. But also our findings from the study we did, where we found that teachers and people of the general public endorsed fewer neuromyths related to autism. We kind of identified that awareness campaigns might help. So what we did was we created at the Center of Educational Neuroscience a number of resources that we call the Neurosense resources. And it includes blogs, but it also includes some video explainers. And we last year, some of my students looked into, does watching video explainers around these neuromyths and neurodevelopmental conditions, does that actually help and reduce the endorsements of neuromyths? And so, again, there were 3 different projects. So we had a student who looked at the impact of the Neurosense campaign in the UK. Another student looked at the impact of the Neurosense campaign in Kuwait, and the other one in Colombia. And so basically what all 3 of them found was that in blue, you see the the column for the neurodevelopmental disorders, neuromyths, before watching the video explainers. In orange, you see after watching the video explainers. And then we had a number of questions which were neuromyths about neurodevelopmental disorders that were not covered in the video explainers. So these were kind of our control questions. So what we see is that although some of these control questions were seen as easier in the UK, it was not the case in Colombia and Kuwait. But what we see is that there is a significant difference between the blue and the orange bar. So between how participants performed before compared to after watching the video explainers in the UK, in Colombia, as well as in Kuwait. And whereas there was no significant difference in how participants scored on neuromyths that weren't covered in the video explainers. And so this suggests that watching the short videos actually made an impact and reduced which neuromyths were endorsed. Now, as I mentioned before, we didn't include dyscalculia in it. So what we did last summer was we developed a dyscalculia toolkit, which was co-produced with teachers in the UK. So we had 2 focus groups with 8 participants in total. In the first focus group, we discussed the findings from our survey from Educational Scotland and the survey in the UK, which I presented today as well. And we kind of asked, like, why do you think teachers are endorsing these neuromyths? What could we do about it if we were to develop a toolkit? What kind of things do you think we should put in that toolkit? And then we developed a toolkit over the summer, and then we had another focus group with these same participants and asked them to provide us with feedback and kind of say, what would you tweak? What else is missing from this? So what we've developed is this toolkit went live last Friday. And you can find it using the QR code or the link at the bottom here of the screen. And so teachers told us, well, you should include some red flags for dyscalculia so we can kind of get a better understanding of who these children are. You should give us an overview on dyscalculia screeners. There are a number of dyscalculia screeners out there, but which ones are good, which ones are based on research evidence, which ones maybe we could avoid or we should use as a second option. Also, teachers wanted to know more about how do we refer children if we think they've got dyscalculia? What's the kind of the process that we should go through? Some top tips for supporting students with dyscalculia, as well as, we know that awareness campaigns and that more knowledge helps. So the idea is like, how can we support teachers to find out more about dyscalculia and support their knowledge? So we're currently working on a video explainer like we've done with the video explainers for the other neurodevelopmental conditions and learning difficulties. We've developed a short course that is an online self-paced short course. We have some blogs about dyscalculia, and we're also having a reading list. The next thing we're doing now is also focusing on a rapid review of what works for students with dyscalculia. So we're doing a review of interventions that have been evaluated through research. And so then we can make a table to say, well, would this kind of method work? Think Singaporean math. What's the evidence for it? Or also called mastery math. What's the evidence for it? And, should it be used or not? And who's it been evaluated with? Sorry. So in terms of what ages has it been evaluated with, what outcome measures have been used, etc. So that's something we're still working on. And to finish for tonight's talk, I just wanted to give you some kind of insight. So this is, for example, the red flags that teachers asked us to prepare. These are very simple materials, and we very much welcome any feedback, but also any other things that you think should be included in the toolkit. This is really the start of the building of this toolkit. As I mentioned, we've got a kind of an infographic around how to refer learners that might have dyscalculia or mathematical learning difficulties. What are the steps that should be taken? What are the top tips? And thank you for listening, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Jo, for this. It was very, very interesting. We tend to be more aware about dyslexia more than dyscalculia. So this was a very fruitful webinar for us all, in fact. It was very, very interesting. We've got some questions. That's the audience. So I have the first one. What is the average age children master number bonds to 10?
It depends a little bit on what kind of school program you're following. So I only know this in the UK, because I know it's different if you're in the UK or in Sweden or in Belgium, for example. In the UK, this is taught in year 2. So this is when children are about 7 years old. But it will differ depending on the country you're in.
So our next question is, if a child with dyslexia has difficulties with maths, do we describe them as having dyscalculia? My experience is that some children with DD have difficulties with some aspects of maths, but they have a good math sense and become very successful mathematicians. The description of dyscalculia seems to suggest a lack of number sense.
So yes, so of course there are children who've got dyslexia, right? And they only have dyslexia and will not have problems with understanding numbers and be very good at maths. The children who've got dyslexia and dyscalculia, what you'll see is that they don't only have problems with writing, but really understanding maths. And sorry, and it's getting the time of the day where I need a bit more coffee. So the difficulty is that some children with dyslexia, so they might not show maths difficulties. So they might have difficulties working out word problems, for example, or understanding word problems when they're reading them, but they would not have problems with arithmetic tasks or mathematical retrieval from any timetables, anything learned like that. Whereas students who have difficulties with both will have difficulties with word problems and understanding them and reading and writing them, as well as retrieving maths facts from memory, for example, and understanding how numbers relate to each other. I hope I answered that a little bit correctly in the end there.
So in the UK study with Education Scotland, were the teaching professionals working in different phases or in only primary schools?
They were working in different phases, so primary and secondary schools. They were all very wide in both our surveys. Yeah.
The next question, is there any evidence suggesting that dyscalculia is language independent? For example, would a bilingual student with dyscalculia struggle with numbers and number facts in both of their languages?
Yes, they should be struggling in both their languages. There is a little bit of evidence. I mean, we mustn't forget that dyscalculia is really under research. So there's a lot we don't know about dyscalculia. There's a lot we don't know about the impact of language and bilingualism as well in terms of mathematical abilities. There is a suggestion that it's easier to learn mathematical abilities in one language compared to another. So there are some languages in which the counting system is more transparent. So think about Welsh, Chinese, Japanese, they're very transparent languages. And then you have those that are very intransparent, such as, Flemish, Dutch, my mother tongue, as well as German, and English and Spanish and etc. They sit in the middle. So there is some transparency, but there are some words that are still new as well in terms of counting. So there's some evidence that it's easier to learn to count in Chinese and Japanese than it would be in Spanish and in English. But of course, the idea is that dyscalculia affects the development of mathematics, the understanding of numbers as a whole. And so it is not language dependent. But of course, so we see also dyscalculia happening in children who speak Chinese, for example, or in children who are Chinese and English bilingual.
Okay, do you have any tips for non-maths teachers to identify dyscalculia?
Yeah, so this is just very simple. Depends on the age of the child. So let's talk about primary school child. These children will have very problems learning the timetables, count on their fingers, not being able to count onwards. So if you say to a child, right, what comes after 5? If the child has to go 6, then these are early signs. It is important, though, that it's really difficult to diagnose as a parent or as a teacher. If people go through our infographic, you'll see it's really about long observation of what kind of things the child can do, what kind of things the child cannot do, and it does require a specialist in the end, just like, you know, a diagnosis for autism, for ADHD, require a specialist to make that diagnosis.
Okay, so might the children low achieving in maths not also show some of the same features you described for dyscalculia, or are the features different?
No, they're very similar, and that's why it's kind of, you know, you make a diagnosis for dyscalculia based on elimination. So it would be, you know, does this child have any other learning difficulties? Does this child have any language difficulties? Does this child, is there anything from the family background we can learn? Do we see problems only in maths classes, but also in other classes? Is it motivational related or not? So it takes a lot of steps to make the difference between children who've got mathematical learning difficulties compared to those who've got dyscalculia. The idea is that children with mathematical learning difficulties, there's some evidence that some are able to grow out of this kind of bottom quartile, whereas what we see in children with dyscalculia, that's very unlikely. So yes, you can put things in place to help them, but it's not like their dyscalculia will get better over time.
Okay, another one. Thank you very much for this informative talk. I wonder if you could please explain a bit more about the relationship between dyscalculia and spatial reasoning.
Okay, so we know to have very good mathematical abilities, there is a relationship with spatial abilities, and this probably comes to the fact that if we think that numbers or good mathematical abilities relate to our number line, our understanding how numbers go together, then we're talking about a spatial line, right? In terms of small numbers on the left and larger numbers on the right. So there's a spatial aspect to it. And so we know that some children with dyscalculia also have difficulties in understanding left from right, which is again another spatial aspect. And so children who are poorer on spatial abilities perform lower on their mathematical abilities. As I said, in dyscalculia, you know, the research is sparse, right? So we don't know a lot yet about what's the difference between children with mathematical learning difficulties and dyscalculia when it comes about spatial abilities. The one thing we do know from typically developing children, this is research by colleagues at the University of Surrey, is that playing with Lego bricks helps children develop mathematical abilities. So there you go. There is definitely a relationship.
Can dyscalculia be diagnosed as early as preschool or kindergarten?
Yes, it can be. As one of the things we did in our studies in 2018, we looked at children who are very low performing. The difficulties, though, is in order to get a diagnosis for dyscalculia, you need to follow up the children. So you need to observe them and do mathematical assessments at least 2 time points, at least 6 months apart. And the children need to perform at the lowest 10th percentile at both time points to get a diagnosis for dyscalculia.
It's the same with reading.
It's the same with reading.
It's the same with reading, and you can't take the same approach for maths.
Absolutely. It's important, you know, because there's so many factors that impact on whether children are good readers or good at mathematics. We need to be very careful with giving a label early onwards. So
Exactly.
It's about collecting the data, taking a holistic point of view.
Throughout life, people with dyslexia usually learn strategies to master reading. Does the same happen to people with dyscalculia?
Oh yes, absolutely. So there is a lovely video. If you go on one of on our short course, there's a video we show of a young woman in her 20s who talks through about what she does in order to get around her dyscalculia. And it's about how you deal with money. So you pay with a card, so you never have to deal with change. It's about having a digital clock. It's about having someone else read a map for you, because reading maps is also a difficulty for people with dyscalculia. So it's all these kind of little things to either avoid or to help, like, you know, always having a calculator in your pocket. Well, these days that's your phone, of course. These kind of little tricks that might help.
Coping strategies.
Coping strategies, indeed. But the thing is that a lot of these coping strategies teachers can actually put in place in a classroom for all children, right?
Exactly. I think all will benefit in the end of the day.
Absolutely, that's it.
At what age is dyscalculia typically diagnosed? Is late diagnosis common?
Yeah, just like dyslexia and ADHD, we see a lot more later diagnosis at the age of 7, 8, when children are very much struggling rather than early diagnosis. It's also because of a lack of awareness, a lack of not only awareness about dyscalculia, but also a lack of awareness around how a diagnosis is made for this learning difficulty.
Have you come across any particular countries that have already established training for pre-service or teachers in initial teacher training programs? Very interesting question.
Very interesting. As far as I know, not on the top of my head, I know there's none in the UK. I went to Finland and there's nothing in Finland. I know it's very limited in Belgium as well. I think it's more, there might be more local, like we see a lot in education, that there are local hubs that do a lot, where there's a lot more training and awareness rather than it being at a country level, for example.
Were the videos shown to the UK participants identical to the videos shown to the participants from the other 2 countries, aside from the language?
Yes, they were identical, but they were translated in Arabic or in both of them it was Arabic, or subtitled for it. There is a limitation, though, indeed, in terms of the participants we had in Kuwait and in South America. It was translated into Spanish. Is that they often come from affluent families because we did it as an online study, and so it's a particular type of participants that took part.
How can we help to improve or develop the learning and performance of students with dyslexia and/or dyscalculia in higher education or at home?
So in higher education, it's still the same as and at home. I mean, have a look at our website with the top tips of what can help, but it's around, providing visual support. So this can be support sheets with the timetables for those who are older, calculators, there's a question around, do they need to know the formula by heart, or could they have, and again, a support sheet that has the formulas on it, but they have to then see which formula applies to what kind of particular context. So that kind of support can help. Giving direct feedback when people are solving a problem is a very important one. So very often people with dyscalculia, same as with dyslexia, they might make an error either in their counting or in their reading, but they don't notice that they've made an error until they come to the end and are asked the question, and then they realize I've made a mistake, but they don't know where. So it's kind of having that direct support where it can be pointed out where they've gone wrong and why they've gone wrong is very important to improve their understanding.
Locally here in Malta, it is recommended to wait for children around 7 years, to wait until they're 7 years to assess for dyslexia. When should we start thinking of looking into diagnosing dyscalculia?
Well, so it can be done very early. It can be done early. I think the important thing is, and this was another point I was going to make with the previous question, is that very often these children who've got dyscalculia, they're missing the foundations. And so when they get diagnosed later, we kind of start to teach them at a level that they're functioning. But actually, we should be brave enough to go back to the early years curriculum and teach some of these foundations again, so that they get kind of reinforced. They need a lot more repetition than a typically developing child needs, for example. So it's not, when they get a diagnosis, it's kind of thinking, well, what else have they already missed from knowledge that they need to repeat it? That needs to be repeated at this age.
We're nearing the end, but I'll ask you a few more. How do you see dyscalculia fit in with the research regarding the 3 maths LD subtypes: semantic, procedural, and visual spatial?
Oh, yeah, it's a very good question. Okay. I think, it's difficult at the moment to make these kind of different subtypes. There's a little bit of evidence actually to suggest that there might be other subtypes as well, in terms of whether the difficulties are caused by processing speed difficulties, that there might be difficulties related to the approximate number sense. Spatial is one of them. So in our own research, we looked at subgroups, as well as I know Daniel Ozansari's group looked at subgroups. there are very limited studies out there. We definitely need to do more research in terms of individual differences. Is dyscalculia as a one group, or are there these different subtypes? I also think very importantly is that we mustn't forget the developmental aspect of these learning difficulties. And I think, the subtypes are often the result of the outcomes of learning, rather than it being a brain with separate areas being impaired from infancy onwards. So it's we need to have a better understanding of, first of all, development in dyscalculia as well, before we can start talking about the different subtypes.
Okay, I have a question about the neuromyth you shared about learning styles. What does the research say about the effectiveness of learning in one's preferred learning style?
That it's a complete myth. So if you're interested more in terms of these neuromyths, at the Center of Educational Neuroscience, if you go to the website there, and I don't know if we can maybe put it in the chat, we have a number of blogs written by myself and colleagues around the evidence for this, and so you can read a lot more about the myths around water and diet and sugar, etc., if you're interested in that research. But yeah, there is evidence to suggest that if you learn in different senses, that helps. So hearing the information, seeing the information, feeling the information, that is all great for learning. But it's not the case that children have a specific learning style in which they would do better, if that makes sense.
And my last question, because we're past time: should teachers teach children differently according to whether they have dyscalculia or are in the bottom percentiles for other reasons, for example, socioeconomic?
No, I think there are a number of things that teachers can do. I think there are different, it depends on what type of support we're seeing. So in the UK, we work with 3 different types of support. So tier 1 would be generally what classroom teachers can do. And this is the kind of, giving direct feedback, working on one problem at a time. So this is kind of looking at our 6 top tips. Tier 2 and tier 3 are much more specific interventions. So for example, Lego therapy might work for children with dyscalculia and those who are low performing. But then there might be some more additional interventions that are required to really make sure that these students catch up or can cope with the educational curriculum. So I think it depends on, at tier 1, everybody will benefit. At tier 2, most children will still benefit, but it's very likely that some students with dyscalculia need also a tier 3 type of intervention that other students might not necessarily need.
Thank you, Joe. This was another successful webinar with very high attendance. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Joe, for your presentation. I think it was really insightful, and we've got a lot of questions, around 25 questions on the topic. So people are really interested in this. And I think you gave also some very practical things that people could, relate to and also think about. I'll be sharing my slide for our next webinar next week. I've also shared the registration. So next week we'll have again Rebecca Gordon with us, and we will be speaking about dyslexia. So I encourage you all to register for this webinar, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you all for attending this. Thank you again, Joe, Michelle, and Erica. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.